Okay, we've been through the upper respiratory system. Now we're on to the lower respiratory system. We mentioned that this opening right along here, the opening to the lower respiratory system right there, is known as the glottis. And that flap above that, indicated right here, is epiglottis. This region above that was the laryngopharynx. This region right here below that point, this is the beginning of the esophagus. Here, this is a side view looking at the upper respiratory system. So this opening right here leads into the first section of the what we call the windpipe or lower respiratory system. And this plate of cartilage right here is the same as this plate right here. We're going to label that. That's the thyroid cartilage. Just below that, another part of the larynx right here, this is called the cricoid cartilage. So thyroid cartilage and cricoid cartilage. And of course this shape here represents the epiglottis here. So all this part right here is larynx. Below that, from here on down, this will all be trachea. The trachea. In the upper part of the larynx, right across through here, make that in orange here. Are a couple of folds that come in. Those are not your vocal folds. Those are your false vocal folds. A little bit lower down here in the larynx, you'll find your true vocal folds. So we have false vocal folds, we have true vocal folds. Another name for the false vocal fold is the vestibular fold. Like I said, it could be called the false vocal fold. We have true vocal folds that are also known as vocal cords. More common name, vocal cords. Now that's actually situated probably a little further down than what I've drawn it. There are additional cartilages in here inside the larynx that increase or decrease tension on the vocal folds. Those cartilages are called arytenoid cartilages. So the arytenoid cartilages have muscles attached to them which can tighten or loosen tension on the vocal cords or true vocal folds in there. Arytenoid cartilages. Another interesting note about this, the thyroid cartilage, as it comes around the outer wall, and the very back part of it, it doesn't come together to make a complete ring around the larynx. So there's a tiny little gap there at the very back, where that cartilage doesn't completely enclose the tube. Cricoid cartilage typically does completely surround the entire tube here. When you get down into the tracheal cartilages below that, they form incomplete rings also, so they don't fuse together in the back. They're like C-shaped rings. They go around part way, but do not fuse right in the very back of the trachea there. The next thing we're going to look at is the histological construction of the tracheal wall. So in the way similar that we looked at esophagus, stomach, and intestines when we did the digestive system, here we'll look at the tracheal wall, and look at the layers in the tracheal wall. In this picture, we'll be labeling layers of the wall of the trachea. Remember, the trachea has rings of cartilage as you go down. So there's a segment with cartilage, and then there's a segment between cartilages, then another segment with cartilage, another segment between cartilages, and so forth. So we've drawn a cut through the cartilage layer here in this example. The inner part, remember, this is the lumen, and this is the trachea. Lumen of the trachea. The first layer of the tracheal wall, this is the epithelial layer. It's a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and it has also mucus secreting cells called goblet cells in there as well. And we'll just say it's respiratory epithelium, respiratory epithelium. The next layer underneath of that, right here, that's that loose connective tissue we've identified before as a lamina propria. Then next to that, this thin dark line right here, this is the elastic membrane. Now you'll recall when we talked about the gut layers, that third layer out there would have been the muscularis mucosa. But here it's a layer of elastic tissue just outside of the lamina propria. Those three layers make up the mucosa layer of the trachea. Next, the submucosal layer consists of connective tissue and glands. These glands are called seromucous glands. Seromucous. Seromucous because they have both a serous or watery component and a mucus thicker component. Seromucous glands and connective tissues make up that next layer, the submucosal layer. So we have the mucosa made of epithelium, lamina propria, and elastic membrane. We have a submucosa that has connective tissue and seromucous glands mixed together. The third layer out here includes both. Let's see, where will we label this? We'll label this right here. This is our hyaline cartilage. So we have the hyaline cartilage, and we have smooth muscle. So outside of the submucosa in the digestive system, we had layers of muscularis mucosa. Muscularis externa. But here we have a cartilage smooth muscle layer, the cartilage smooth muscle layer. Both of those elements in there. Remember, the cartilage doesn't come together at the very back of the trachea, but the smooth muscle bridges across that gap. This allows the trachea to constrict somewhat or relax and open up more. The very outside layer, most extreme outside layer here, is the adventitia. It's a loose connective tissue that just kind of meets the loose connective tissues that surround the other organs. This is not within a body cavity, it's in your mediastinum, so there's not going to be a mesothelial covering on the outside of the trachea. Here's a view of the website for the comparative anatomy class that we've been to a few times. I can give you this link as well, but this is showing the cartilages associated with the larynx right here. We have the epiglottis in this blue-green color, the transparent view of the thyroid cartilage, which is the hyaline cartilage, there in the front. Down at the bottom we have the cricoid cartilage. Remember, the cricoid goes completely around the larynx. The two arytenoid cartilages, which can pivot to tighten or loosen your vocal cords. Above that we have a couple of other cartilages called corniculate cartilages. Actually, there are a couple more cartilages in addition to those that are called cuneiform cartilages that lie just lateral to either of those, a little more to the front. So that's a see-through view of the larynx there. Here's a lateral view of the larynx, esophagus, and laryngopharynx. The epiglottis shown here, a little circle to show the glottis, false vocal fold and true vocal fold there. The thyroid cartilage is shown on the front side, but it's not shown in the back. If we cut right down the middle, there won't be any thyroid cartilage on the back side because it doesn't completely encircle the entire larynx there. The cricoid cartilage is thicker in the back and thinner in the front, but does make a complete ring. And then finally, the tracheal cartilages do not come together in the back either. So if we make a cut down the middle, we won't cut through those in the very center of the back of the trachea. Another drawing from the same web page. Here's our cross section, like the one we had on the board there a minute ago, showing the mucosal layer. We don't divide it out into layers, subdivided layers of mucosa in this illustration. Then there's a submucosa that has the glands in it. Then the cartilage ring in blue that doesn't go all the way around. It stops here and here, so there's this gap. And there's smooth muscle that bridges across the gap in there. And on the very outside, the adventitia. Here's a view of the entire trachea, and here's where it splits at the very bottom to go to the two lungs, the left and right lung, through the primary bronchi. Here's the thyroid and cricoid cartilages of the larynx. There's the epiglottis, and here we show how the hyoid is kind of like a horseshoe shape around that epiglottis. This illustration here just concentrates on the mucosal layer of the trachea. You can see the ciliated cells here, this little cilia on the top. It's a pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And these spots like this here, this, those are clumps of mucus in goblet cells of that respiratory epithelium. So we have ciliated cells and we have goblet cells, and then we have some basal cells in here too. But anyway, it's primarily ciliated cells and goblet cells that line the trachea, make up that pseudostratified epithelium. Next is the lamina propria layer, mostly a loose connective tissue, lots of lymphocytes scattered in there. And then this band right here, which I should have had labeled right there, there's your elastic layer right there. The elastic layer. Beyond the elastic layer, you have the submucosa, which goes on much more than what's shown in that picture. This shows all the histological layers of the trachea. Here we have the mucosa, right here, made up of epithelium, lamina propria, and the elastic membrane, all three of those. Next we have the submucosal zone, and in that we have some glands. There's a nice little gland right there, some blood vessels in there as well. So there's the submucosa. Then there's the cartilage, the hyaline cartilage. And in this tissue sample we had a wide separation of some of our tissues. That's not supposed to be that way. But anyway, our smooth muscle is way over there. It should be brought in up here right next to that elastic cartilage. Our tissues got pulled apart. And on the far left is the adventitia. At the lower end of your trachea, passages of the windpipe split into the two primary bronchi. The primary bronchus to one side will branch out within the lung and give rise to smaller branches and smaller branches as we go out into the tiny air passages of the lung. So this is sometimes referred to as the primary bronchus. That primary bronchus will branch into smaller bronchi that are sometimes referred to as lobular bronchi. Most often refer to them as secondary bronchi or lobular bronchi. And then beyond that, these are sometimes referred to as segmental bronchi, or they could be called tertiary. So primary, secondary, and tertiary, or the primary bronchus, sometimes called the main bronchus, lobular bronchus, and segmental bronchus, going out through the lung. Those will then branch further into bronchioles. Our next smaller passageway is the bronchiole. The cartilages associated with the trachea were almost complete rings that didn't quite come together in the back. When you go into the bronchus, they're not quite as complete still and can form like little plates on the outside. The plates get smaller and smaller as you go out through the secondary and tertiary passages. When you get to the bronchioles, you completely lose those cartilage supports on the outside of the tubes. Further inside the lung, you have the bronchioles that divide into smaller and smaller passages, smaller bronchioles as you go. Eventually you enter in what's called a terminal bronchiole, which its name implies that it's the last one, but then there's a little segment beyond that that's referred to as a respiratory. These are respiratory bronchioles. And then finally, you're into what's called an alveolar duct. Surrounding the alveolar duct are these small sac-like passages or spaces we call alveoli. A single one would be an alveolus. So our pathway of air coming through from our glottis, it'd go through your larynx, through the trachea. From the trachea, it branches out into the primary bronchus, then the secondary and tertiary bronchi, then into bronchioles, and bronchioles get smaller and smaller, lead into terminal bronchioles that branch out into small respiratory bronchioles that lead into these alveolar ducts, and then finally you have the alveolar air sacs. That is where you have the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the air. So it's down in this part, around those alveolar walls, where you have the true respiration or exchange of gases between air and blood for the body. In this picture, we see the alveolar spaces of the lung. This is an alveolar space, here's an alveolar space, there'd be a space here, and a space up here. These cells that are found along the wall of the alveolus that are flattened cells that lie next to the capillaries, that we're going to look at in a minute, this is what we call a type 1 alveolar cell. They line most of the alveolar space. Sometimes along some of the margins of the alveoli, we're going to see what we call a type 2 alveolar cell. It's type 1. Type 1 alveolar, so this is type 2 up here. They are more cuboidal and they are found usually at the septum, and for that reason they're sometimes called septal cells. Septal cells or type 2 alveolar cells. This is a capillary right here. Here's another capillary with 2 blood vessels in it here. They have endothelium. So they're lined by endothelial cells, and inside of the capillaries you'll find your red blood cells. So the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide would be between the blood cells here and this air space here. So the only barrier between the two, the blood and the air, is the endothelial cell of the capillary and the type 1 alveolar cell of the lung. In addition to those cell types, the endothelium and the 2 types of alveolar cells and the blood cells that go through the vessels, we have another cell type. These are macrophage cells that are intended to remove debris from your alveoli. So this is a alveolar macrophage. Also known as a dust cell. Alveolar macrophage or dust cell. So that's the detailed view of what's going on in the alveoli of your lungs, deep inside your lungs. We have the alveolar spaces or cavities. We have 4 of those cavities here. They are lined with type 1 alveolar cells. At some of the corners, we're going to see some type 2 alveolar cells where the septa come together, the dividing parts. And then each blood vessel is surrounded by endothelium. We have a lot of capillaries that go through here. In the capillaries we have red blood cells. And then finally, out in the alveolar space up against the wall here, we see some macrophage cells that are defensive cells that remove debris from the wall of the alveolus. Here's another drawing representing an alveolus here, and the type 1 alveolar cells have flattened nuclei. They're simple squamous cells that line those alveolar spaces. Type 2 alveolar cells are more cuboidal cells that occur along the septa that divide the different alveoli. And on this drawing, there is capillary with 3 red blood cells. There's a red blood cell there. Capillary wall. These are endothelial cells that line the capillaries. So there's that, the blood in here and the air out here. There's the contact where the exchange is made between the capillary and the air, between oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. Here's a couple of microscopic views of the same thing. These spaces are alveolar spaces, open spaces out here. On the margins, we'll find those little flattened cells, the type 1 alveolar cells there. Type 2 alveolar cells, or septal cells seen here. There's an endothelial cell inside of a capillary. There's a capillary right there, and its endothelial nucleus adjacent. Here are a few of those alveolar macrophage cells or dust cells. Here's one right here, there's one here, and one right here. So these open spaces are the alveoli. There's a type 1 alveolar cell nucleus. There are capillaries. There's a nice capillary right there. Capillaries running through the walls surrounding the alveoli.